Hello and welcome back. So in our last video, we were talking about getting our scene set up and getting it ready to render. And in that video, we had a little bit of issues with the glass, actually getting the glass kind of set up. One of the things that was happening with the glass material is that the interior part of our glass wasn't showing. So it was showing the reflection, but not showing any of the refraction of the glass through the surface. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back through and kind of go back over setting this whole entire scene up. So right now, if I look at this render, this is the render of my scene. So there's no materials in here. I've got this basic wine kind of flute. I've got this candlestick, these little tin boxes, my oranges, and the plate that they sit on. And if you currently look right now, I've got just basic light kind of set up inside of here. And my lighting setup, as you can see here inside of Max, I've got two lights set up in here and then one giant globe around my entire world. And we'll talk about what these things are doing for my scene. So first of all, let me turn off some of these parameters and show you what's happening without this stuff turned on. So let's go back in here. I'm going to just disable this for a second. And what I'm going to do is I am just going to hide that selection, and I'm going to look at my two lights, and I've just got two photometric lights in here, and they're both spotlights. Well, not spotlights, but target lights rather. So they're both photometric target lights, and this photometric light here this is my key light, and I've got this light realistically set up to do advanced ray trace shadows. So you'll see in the general parameters, it has light, it has targeted turned on, and then I've got shadows checked, and I've got advanced ray trace shadows. These ray trace shadows are giving me this nice kind of defined shadow. If I change this ray traced in here to area shadows, for instance, and I go back and re-render this, and let's give it a second. It'll take a minute or two to render. Not too long. Looks like it's about a minute. Well, let's actually stop that render, make sure we have the right scene selected. So let's put it on this scene right here, and I'm going to render this again. And while this is rendering, I'm going to pause the video and then come right back to it. So as you can see, this is my render, and if we look at it again, I can show you the light that we've actually changed. I've got my key light sitting right here to the left of my camera, and my key light right here, this is the hottest light in my scene. So this is realistically a 2-point light setup that I have going on. Now this light is my key light, and if I click on my key light really quick, let's just click on it, I can start to see let's look at some of the parameters for my key light. So let's get this so we can see some more of these parameters in here. So for my key light, I can see right now that for my key, I actually have shadows turned on, and I've got mental ray shadow maps turned on. Now, if you look at my render, this is not the type of shadows that we really want showing up for our final render. This still looks very unclean. It actually looks rather poor in quality when we look at this overall. So what I need to start doing to adjust these shadow maps, and realistically shadow maps are kind of a shadow material. So for one thing, I've got this turned on mental ray shadow map. I'm going to go down here to this rollout that says mental ray shadow map and open this up and look at it. So right now I can see that I'm using a map size of 512. So that's a pretty low quality map size. If we're talking about pixels, because realistically this map size translates into pixels, that's actually relatively very low quality. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to bump up the kind of resolution of this shadow map. And I'm going to clone this so we can see the difference between the two. So this is cloned. So I've got this clone sitting here right now. And let's look at my clone, and I'm going to go back and I'm going to re-render this. And this shouldn't take too long at all because we've turned off a lot of the other calculations, and we're only going to see, let me make sure we're It's the only thing that kind of is a little bit irritating about Mac sometimes. You have to make sure you click back into your right viewport, or your render will render for some weird angle. So I can see this is my secondary render, and I can already see that my render is a little bit cleaner than the last one. So I've bumped up the resolution of the shadow map to give myself a little bit more detail. And I can see here on my flute and here is candlestick. I'm really starting to see some shadows. It's still quite blocky, but I still can see some shadows. Now, the one thing that you don't want to do, and this would be the first thought to do. Well, you know what? I've turned up my map size. I've doubled it once, so if I double it again, then it's going to be fantastic, right? So let's go back and re-render it, and we'll look and see how this looks now. And I can see that, yeah, I'm getting a little bit better shadow, but it's still rather grainy. There's still a lot of grain going on with it. So one thing I can tell you, instead of bumping this number up constantly, I'm going to knock it back down to 1024. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to sample this just a little bit more. So instead of 4 samples, I'm going to use 16 samples. So that means that my shadow is going to get sampled 16 times for each shadow. So this aliasing and this fuzziness that's happening should clear up significantly without increasing the size of my texture map. Alright, so let's go back and look at this. And I can see it's cleaned it up a little bit. And a lot of these areas that were, kind of really speckly in my shadow is starting to get cleaned up. So we want to go ahead, now that we know that we've got kind of our samples, we've got how many samples are going to happen on this thing, then we can go back in here and start to adjust up our map size. The reason why I say that is that you don't want to just jump up and go straight to this high number, and because sometimes, depending on the object that you're trying to actually have shadows on, it can look better with a lower quality shadow map, and then you just do some additional samples on it. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to probably bump my samples up to 32. I'm going to sample this a couple more times and see what it's looking like. Let's get the sampling going on. So it's sampling. It's a little bit cleaner. Still kind of dirty. Right? So other thing that I want to do is I want to actually change the sample range, and I'm going to go up with my sample range. So I want to sample more pieces as I go up. So let's keep this and let's compare these two. So I'm going to render. And my clone just opened off in another window to the side, so we'll be able to see this in just a second. Now you can start to see that by bumping up my sample range, I'm really able to get some really nice soft shadows to this. So I'm getting these nice soft shadows, and if I start bringing this back down, if I put this down like to 0.5 per se, and let's make another clone of this and render this one more time. Actually renders pretty quick, and that's one thing you want to make sure that you're making a really good decision on. The things that render quickly, as opposed to you want to make a good distinction between rendering quickly and then also making sure that you have your items looking kind of defined. So you want to make sure it's a nice balance between the two. And let's look, and it's getting a little bit better. One thing I think I want to do is I want to come back in here and let's bring this back down, because I think it's blowing out my sample. So my sampling range is rather large, so let's bring that down a little bit. And there we go. So the thing that's really nice about using these shadow maps is that, one, you get these nice soft edges to the shadows. Ray trace shadows give you a really hard crisp, distinct, almost cartoony shadow at times. And sometimes if a shadow is really close to its object, it'll have that very, you know, almost defined edge to it. But in reality, shadows have this very soft fall off kind of area, like this soft fall off area in here. So you want to make sure that your shadows are kind of fitting in this. Now, let's see what happens when we bump our shadow map size back down. And let's see what we get in our render. And let's keep this. So this is going to be my render at 2048 on my map size and a sampling range of 0.02 and samples of 32. So let's render this, and this is going to be the one we're rendering right now is going to be 1024 shadow map. So let's see if we still get a nice clean shadow. And you can start to see that as you adjust these numbers, it does realistically affect what you're getting and how clean your shadow is. You know, because I could come back in here and say, well, you know what? This is what I'm going to do. I'm going to put this at like 0.9. Let's get that, and 0.9. Let's do 0.09. Let's try that. And let's re-render another one. So you can see what that sampling range is really doing for me. So that sampling range actually adjusts how far out that shadow gets sampled from its source. So you can see by adjusting the sampling size, I've actually been able to get a pretty nice soft shadow, and then my shadow map isn't any larger than it was last time. So if I bump this down to, let's say, 0, 6, let's see what we get. And the cool thing too is that by adjusting this and knowing what you're adjusting the right way, you can make your render times actually speed up. So right now I'm at 18 seconds, which is pretty good for this render. So you can see I'm getting some nice shadows. They're a little too heavy, but you know, kind of how it ends up going. I'm just going to put this back to render quality settings. I'm going to do this, and let's do this at 0.3, and I'm only going to do half samples. The other thing I want to do is I want to turn on transparent shadows. Right, so I'm going to turn on these transparent shadows, and then my sample pixel size, I'm going to change that to 8. So instead of only sampling 4 pixels, I want to sample 8 pixels, and that'll give me a smoother result too for my transparent shadows. So let's see what my shadows look like now. I've got transparent shadows turned on. I've got my sampling pretty large, pretty high, and now we should look at these shadows, and my shadows actually look relatively good. I'm getting that nice, soft corona effect of my shadows. It's starting to look pretty natural, and I actually like the way that it's going so far. So right now, my scene is kind of flat. And what I mean by saying that my scene is kind of flat is that there really isn't a differentiation of color. There's no tone. There's no tonal value set to my scene. So I want to set up a tonal value. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my light lister, because this is a really quick way to get to your lights. I'm going to go my light lister, and you can see I've got my key light and I've got my fill light. And maybe for my fill light, I'm going to change the fill light from being ray trace shadow, from being mental ray shadows to maybe being advanced ray trace. And I can show you the difference of what these guys kind of look like by doing that. And let's see. Let's put this back to where it's supposed to be. So yeah, so there we go. So let's see how this looks really, really quick. So you can see if I use, and right now my fill light has these ray trace shadows on them, and you can see these ray trace shadows, they look like black cutouts. They're not very, they don't really work. So I'm going to put this right back to where it was and put it back on my mental ray shadow maps. And these, since they're they're not going to be seen as closely, and they're kind of faint on the wall over here, I'm not going to keep the sample as high. I'm going to sample this maybe at 0.02, and I'm going to sample range is going to be 0.02, and I'm going to put my samples at like 8, and I'm going to leave the size at 512 because you're not going to be able to see these very well. So the other thing I want to do is right here, you'll see that for my key light, I'm going to click on my key light again so I can select it. And what I want to do is look at the intensity, color, and attenuation. So for my color, I want to change that to be something, that I can really push a little bit of an orangey, warmer feel in my color palette inside of my room. So I'm going to change this filler color. I'm going to push this a little bit more towards orange. And we should see that when we do our render this time. So once again, I'm going to click and keep a clone of this. I always try to keep clones so that I can see my last render compared to my newest render. One of the things I like to do when I'm doing look development is be able to do what we really call more like a wedge for look development. And that means making incremental changes, and you might go from 10 to 20 to 30, and then maybe even 40. And that wedge, that's like a 4 movement wedge, so you can see what your changes have been within that 4 degrees of movement from 10 to 40. It's easy to keep up with the changes that you make. You don't want to go through, especially when you're doing lighting, you don't want to just set up a bunch of lights, go through and do a bunch of settings, and then just hope for the best. Because lighting really is something that can set the mood. It's almost like it's another actor on screen. So if you're not taking the time to really push it, then it's going to end up biting you in the butt in the end. So the other thing I can see is right here on this back wall, right across this line right here, I'm thinking that this is my secondary shadow that's giving me these issues from my fill light. So that means that the map size is still a little bit too low. So I'm going to bump that up to about 1024. And let's keep a clone of our last render. And let's render this. And I've got my clone as well. And my clones, when I click on the clone button, for me, if it doesn't pop up, don't freak out. It's just that my clone window probably opens, well, not probably, it does. It opens up on a secondary monitor. Because realistically, when you're doing this stuff like this, it's really nice to have more than one monitor so that you can be able to get this stuff kind of dedicated out. So we can see that by changing the map size, my shadow map size, I can see that I cleaned up this edge right here. And if you look right here, this was the original edge when my fill light was set to 512, and this is my fill light set to 1024 for the map size for that shadow. So let's talk about some other things that are going to make this lighting actually work and start to get some materials and stuff inside of my scene. The other thing is this. Right now we're looking at what's more or less a clay render. This clay render is just the basic lighting in my scene. There's no materials on anything. Everything actually has this nice even gray on it because I'm trying to just set up my lights and my tone for my scene. So let's start getting some materials in here because we're going to do some little bit more. We're going to do a little bit more advanced pieces as we move forward. But right now, let's just get our material set up for our render. Now, two things. One, to get to your material editor, all you need to do, I'm going to close down all these other guys in here. So to get to your material editor, all you have to do is hit the M key. So M for material, right? So there's two things. One, there is the fact that inside of Max, you actually have materials. This realistically is a misnomer because these are not materials, these are actually shaders. A material would be a 2D image that you use in conjunction inside of a shader. And that would give you the physical representation of a particular surface that you're trying to create. So Max has always called these materials, and that's kind of it used to be these things were used kind of interchangeably. That you could call it a a shader or a material. But to make definitions a little bit easier and a little bit better, I've gotten into the habit of making sure that students call it what it really is. It's really a shader. There's some people that they spend their entire day and night making shaders. They can make anything that you physically see, and you can do it in a shader if you really know what you're doing. So shader has gone way beyond just using like an image or anything like that. Shaders can be be a godsend when you're working on production type stuff. So first things first, these are actually shaders, right? So I've got these standard shaders in here, and the standard ones are like architectural, blend, composite, my DirectX, my double-sided, ink and paint. These are all 3D Studio Max shaders. Now, if you look, currently I have Mental Ray shaders inside of my version of Max. Now, you might be looking at your particular Slate material editor right now, and you're saying, but I don't have Mental Ray materials. Well, I'm going to show you how to activate those Mental Ray materials. So to do that, all I'm going to do is come in here and go to Render Setup. Let this pop up. Let's give it a second. And here it is. So inside of my Render Setup, I'm going to come here to Common, and I'm going to scroll down inside of Common, and I'm going to go down until I see the Assign Renderer Rollout, this guy right here. So I'm going to click on Assign Renderer, and where it says Production, there's a box to the right hand side of this that has 3 little white dots. I'm going to click that where it says Choose Renderer. And you can see inside of here I've got a couple of different choices for my renderer. Now by default your renderer by default is going to be default scanline renderer. Now what I did was, and I'll go back and do it. So if I look at this right now, you see that I've reactivated the default scanline renderer, and you'll actually see inside of materials my Mental Ray tab is gone. But when I come in here, so I open up my render settings, go to Common, and I came all the way down here to where it says Assign Renderer, and click on the 3 dots next to Production, and I'm going to load up NVIDIA Mental Ray and hit OK. And when I do that, you see I get a whole new listing of materials. These shaders that are inside of Mental Ray, these are physically accurate shaders that have been built that you actually can use. So I can see inside of here I've got my Arkin Design, I've got Autodesk Ceramics, Concrete, Generic, Glazing, Hardwood, Masonry. These are all shaders that you can use in your work. Right? It's completely fine for you to use these guys in your work. So this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to use a couple of different shaders inside of here. The first shader I'm going to use is this Arkin Design shader. And inside of my slate, the slate area is unlimited. It's massive. You can put as many pieces of whatever you want in, or as many shaders as you want inside of here, and maps and everything else. So here's a cool little trick, and this is something that's really nice with the introduction of the slate editor, is to make sure that you're working with the appropriate shader. You have to make sure you double click on your shader in the basic viewport here inside of the slate. So when you double click on a particular shader, it will put the dotted line around it, almost like the marching ants, almost like in Photoshop, and you know that this is currently the shader that you're dealing with. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change the name of this. I'm going to make this candle stick. Because you want to name these shaders, because you're going to end up with a lot of these in the scene. You don't want to just have them all named, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So here inside of this architectural and design, so Art plus Design, and this is a Mental Ray shader, a native Mental Ray shader, you'll see it says Choose Template. I'm going to click that and bring up my template menu, and you can see it shows me appearance and attributes. So I can do a matte, pearl, or glossy finish. I can do varnish wood, glossy wood, thin glass geometry, solid geometry, and I've got these chromes in here and all these other things. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this particular thing on, like, let's say we use copper. And I'm looking at that copper, and I really don't like that copper. I don't love it. So I'm going to go and use a different copper, I think. I'm going to go in here and get my Autodesk Metals. And let's look at the Autodesk Metal. Let's see what they've got going on. Let's see if theirs looks a little bit better. So I'm going to go here and double click on this so I can make sure that I have that shader selected, right? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this metal to copper. And actually, let's not do copper. Let's do brass. Yeah. Yeah, let's do brass. I like the brass. Okay. And I'm going to do brushed brass. So there's my brushed brass. And if you notice, if I hit the L key, it'll frame up everything inside of my slate editor. If I look at this right now, everything on the left hand side, so everything over here, these are basically outputting into the shader. So this is a map and this is a map that are being driven into this to make this particular shader. And then over here on the right hand side, this is the output. So this is how you connect it to an object inside of 3D Space. So let's show you. So I'm going to grab this and I'm going to drag this to my candlestick. So my candlestick is now bronze. And I'm going to change the name of this from default metal. And I'm going to make this candle stick. And let's go to this guy right here and let's rename. Actually, let's double click on him. Let's just delete him. We'll add another one in. And so the next thing I need a glass. So for the glass, I'm going to use this Arkendesign. And let's see if we can get glass going on in here. And I'm going to say template. And I'm going to use, let's do like a thin glass. Excuse me. So let's do like a thin glass here. And I can see this glass. And this is one thing you have to pay attention of when you're doing glass is you want to make sure that this thing is actually reflecting and refracting the right way. So right now I see 4 highlights on this shader. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up here to the very top and you'll see it says show background and preview. I'm going to turn that on. I want to make sure that I can actually see through my glass. And this looks like glass. So everything looks fine with this glass. Now, one thing you have to do if you have a one-sided object, one thing that you have to do with these Arkendesign materials is that you need to go into the advanced rendering options, and usually by default it'll say backface culling. When you want to be able to show both sides of a mesh, at least with these particular shaders, you need to make sure you uncheck backface culling. Because if you turn that on, you won't see, and you can even see what it just did inside of my glass. By turning on backface culling, it shows this reflective surface, but it's not refractive. So if I turn off backface culling, you'll see that it's reflective and refractive, and that's what I really want. So I'm going to drag this onto my wine flute. So let's get the output of this shader and in here, and that's good. So let's see, this is my glass, and there it is right there. And then let's keep on moving. Let's keep moving this train along. And I'm going to minimize these guys. So that's minimized. Let's minimize that guy too. It's minimized. And for this, I've got this all grouped together, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to just come in here and I'm going to say group and I say open. When I open up a group, I can then once again click on the individual pieces inside of the group. So that makes it a really easy job. So I'm going to make this also a shader, But I'm just going to make a standard shader for this because this is going to be an orange. So I need to do some standard things with this. And I'm going to double click on this shader so that I can rename it. And this is going to be orange. And I'm just going to select all my oranges. And I'm going to right click on that shader. And I'm going to say that I want to assign this shader. And it should let me, there we go, assign this material, we talked about this whole material thing. Assign this material to selection. So that's assigned. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to come in here really quick and go to my diffuse color, which is the color we actually perceive with our eyes. That's kind of your diffuse. I'm just going to change that orange, just so we know it's oranges, right? And I'm going to make another shader. This time I'm going to use my architectural and design shader. And I'm going to connect that to this plate. And then let's go inside this Arc and Design material. And what I want to make this into, I want to make this into a satin metal for right now. And you can see there's that satin metal. Nice anisotropic highlights that kind of wisp around this whole form. And I'm going to grab the output of this and I'm going to output it to my actual plate. Alright, so I'm going to make sure this goes on my plate. That's good. And then my two little tin boxes over here. So I'm going to add another Arc and Design material. And I'm going to give one of these to each one of your boxes. So let's double click on this. And there's my Arc and Design material. And let's rename this. So boxes. And I'm going to once again attach this and attach this. So we've got all of our basic shaders applied to my objects. Now you'll remember I made the orange shader, but it doesn't have a lot of the other things that's going to make this look like an orange. So what I'm going to do right now is just going to render this really quick. See what my render looks like. I'm going to pause this while it's rendering. So after that last render, we can see this is what my base materials look like. So this is what the base light inside of my scene is, and this has the shaders on it. So I can see this brass shader in here. The orange just has the color orange, but I don't have any physical properties to make the orange, really be an orange yet. The glass is working. I can kind of see through my glass, and I'm seeing it cast the light color on the wall, which is great. All those things work well for the glass that I'm trying to make. So now I need to actually go in here, and I still need to do a little bit more setup. One of the things that you'll see that I did in the very beginning of this video is that I had a dome in here. And for that dome, all I did was I did a couple of things for that dome. So let me come in here and let me not hide anything. Let me unhide all. So you'll see I have this dome, and it's just a giant sphere. And it's a sphere, and what I did was I put a normal modifier on it. So I went into made a sphere, went inside and put on normal. And what that does is when we go inside of the sphere, so I made the sphere as big as the entire scene, so that everything that I have inside my scene could be encapsulated inside of the sphere. Now I did that for two reasons. One, metals and reflective surfaces are only as good as the objects that they reflect. So if those things don't have anything to reflect, then they don't really look like the metals that we're used to seeing. So one, I wanted to give my world a definition, so it kind of stops and reflects, just in that space. The other thing is that I want to use this particular sphere. I want to use this for the color of the sphere. Now this sphere does not have a shader on it. It's just the color. So right here beside sphere, I'm just going to change this to dome. I'm just going to change this to ref underscore light dome. So this is just going to be my reflected light. So this is going to be my reflected light into my scene. So it's orange. It just happens to be orange, right? So I want this thing to actually bounce in secondary light into my scene and onto my objects. So it's really easy to do. One, I'm going to use the color of this object, which is orange. Actually, just to show the point, I'm going to change it to a really weird color, like a purple. All right. And I'm going to go into my render settings once again. And in my render settings, I'm going to go in here to a tab that says Global Illumination. Now, global illumination is just how light happens in real life. With global illumination turned on, your lights will start to bounce back light and have reflected light strike surfaces. So with Final Gather, I'm going to, inside of my global illumination, I'm going to turn on Final Gather and I'm going to leave it at draft. Actually, I'm going to put it at low for right now. And I'm going to render my scene again. So let's render this again. And remember, all the thing I've done right now is I've set up two lights. I've put my shaders onto my objects. And now I'm just activating Final Gather and I have my dome in there. And the dome has, the color on it. And from those two, I'll be able to get my next render and we can see how that's going to look. And actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and pause this again right here. And when we come back, you can see what the rendered result is with my dome and Final Gather turned on. So we can see by activating Final Gather and having this purple sphere in my world that the purple is starting to be reflected in my shadows. It's starting to be reflected in the reflections, and it's kind of picking up this nice, look all throughout. Now, what I'm going to do is I don't want to use purple because it's a little too drastic. I'm going to use something that's more in this warm orange family, and let's actually keep this, clone it out, and I'm going to re-render this so we can look at the two. And I'm going to pause this really quick so this will render out.